My relatives and mom, after finding out about my $20 million inheritance and house, suddenly started caring about my life. They wanted to take all and sue me. I got a text, "Thanks for the funds. It's tough to put into words what it feels like to grow up feeling like an outsider in your own home." I guess the real shift happened when I was 14, the year my mom, Kate, married Tom. Up until then, it had just been the two of us against the world. Or at least, that's what I'd always believed. After my dad took off when I was little, it was me and my mom through thick and thin. We didn't have much, but we made it work. She used to tell me I was her rock, her reason to keep going, and I believed her. I never thought anything could change that. But then Tom came along, and everything flipped so fast it felt like I blinked and suddenly didn't matter anymore. Tom was successful, had a nice house, and came with a son of his own, Alex. When my mom was around him, she seemed lighter, like maybe she thought all our problems had finally been solved. At first, I tried to see it that way too. After all, Tom treated her well, took her on fancy dates, bought her thoughtful gifts, and even helped her out with some bills she'd been struggling to pay. For a moment, I let myself think, maybe this could actually work. But moving into Tom's house? That wasn't a fresh start. It was more like walking straight into enemy territory. Sure, the place was gorgeous. Big yard, tons of space, even rooms that didn't seem to have a purpose. But from the moment I stepped inside, I knew it wasn't mine. Every inch screamed, Tom and Alex. I was just there. An unwanted guest. I should have known where things were headed when Tom wouldn't even let me redecorate my room. When I asked my mom about it, she just laughed it off, saying, "Oh, you know how he is. He's particular about his stuff." Yeah, he was particular all right. Particularly uninterested in me or anything that mattered to me. At first, Tom was polite but distant. He never really tried to get to know me, and when he spoke to me, it was like I was some random kid off the street, not someone living under his roof. No casual "how was your day?" or "how's school?" Nothing like that. Instead, it was always flat, impersonal stuff like "don't leave your shoes in the hallway" or "make sure you turn the lights off when you leave the room." I don't even think he looked at me as a person, just Kate's kid. When I asked my mom about it, she'd just sigh and say, "He just needs some time to adjust, Ben. This is new for him too." As if he was the one who had to uproot his life and start over. And then there was Alex. Tom's son was only a year younger than me, but he couldn't have been more different. He was everything his dad wanted, a golden boy. Smart, athletic, charming, the kind of guy people just seemed to gravitate toward. Everyone liked Alex, and honestly, I could see why. Alex was the kind of guy who could charm a whole room without even trying. Confident, outgoing, the type to throw huge parties in high school with a line of people outside, all desperate to get in. Meanwhile, I was not that. Awkward, quiet, maybe a little too obsessed with video games and comics. We were polar opposites, and that divide couldn't have been clearer whenever we were in the same space. Alex had his own circle of friends, and I had mine, though "had" turned out to be the key word. Little by little, he started chipping away at my friendships. He'd make these sly comments, things that seemed harmless at first but dug deep the longer they sat with you. Stuff like, "Ben's kind of a loner, isn't he?" Or "Why do you even hang out with him so much?" It was subtle, but effective. Before long, my friends weren't coming around anymore. Instead, I'd hear them downstairs, laughing it up with Alex, while I stayed holed up in my room, pretending not to care. Eventually, the jabs became less subtle. When no one else was around, Alex would drop these mean, cutting remarks and then laugh like it was all a big joke. "You know Dad didn't even want you guys here, right?" Or, "You're just lucky my dad's such a softie for charity cases." I'd try to act like it didn't bother me, but the truth? It hurt. It hurt because I knew he was only saying out loud what Tom probably kept to himself. When I tried to talk to my mom about it, she just wouldn't hear it. She was too wrapped up in her shiny new life with Tom to notice what was happening to me. Any time I brought up how Tom ignored me or how Alex was turning my friends against me, she'd brush it off with the same tired excuse. "Oh, Ben, don't be so sensitive. They're just adjusting." As if adjusting was a free pass to treat me like garbage. And if I said anything negative about Tom or Alex, forget it. She'd get defensive, almost like she was protecting them more than she was willing to stand up for me. Eventually, I gave up trying to talk to her. It wasn't worth the fight. Every time I did, It felt like running full speed into a brick wall. She'd just sigh and repeat the same lines, like a broken record. Give them time. Things will get better. Except they didn't. Things got worse. Tom was big on rules, strict ones, and it felt like they only ever applied to me. No dishes in the sink, no TV after 10 p.m., keep your room spotless. Meanwhile, Alex could do whatever he wanted, and if I ever brought it up, Tom would just wave it off with some nonsense like, boys will be boys. As if I wasn't one of those boys too. It felt like Tom was constantly watching me, just waiting for me to slip up so he could remind me, yet again, that this was his house. I remember one night in particular. I'd been up late working on a huge project for school, and in my exhaustion, I accidentally left my backpack in the living room. I was so wiped I didn't even think about it. Tom found it the next morning before I had a chance to grab it. He walked into my room holding the bag like it was a bomb about to go off, his face twisted in this look of utter disgust. In this house, he said coldly, we don't leave our things lying around. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just his house. It was his world. And I didn't belong in it. In this house, we don't leave our things lying around, Tom said, his tone icy. Then he added, with a look that sent a chill down my spine, if you can't follow the rules, maybe you should think about finding somewhere else to live. I was barely 16. 16, and he was already making it clear he wanted me gone. It was like a slap in the face, a reminder that no matter what I didn't belong there. School wasn't much better. Whatever influence Alex had at home had spilled over into the hallways. It wasn't just my old friends ignoring me anymore, it felt like everyone avoided me. Teachers, classmates, even people I barely knew seemed to look through me like I was invisible. Then the rumors started. People whispered that I was antisocial, that my home life was weird. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. Alex had this way of spinning everything, making himself look like the golden boy and me like the screw-up. I started retreating further into myself, hiding out in my room whenever I was home. I avoided Tom and Alex at all costs, spending hours alone. My grades took a nosedive, not that anyone noticed. Honestly, I figured if no one else cared, why should I? The only person who really had my back was Ethan, my best friend. He'd been around long before all this, back when it was just me and Mom against the world. He got it. He understood what it felt like to be stuck, isolated, like you didn't belong anywhere. We'd hang out after school sometimes, and I'd unload everything. Tom's impossible rules, Alex's constant needling, the way I felt like I was disappearing in my own life. Ethan would listen quietly, nodding like he really got it. Then he'd say something like, you just have to make it through a few more years. Once we're out of here, we can start fresh somewhere else. It was a comforting thought, leaving it all behind. But it didn't make surviving the day-to-day any easier. One night, while we were talking, Ethan asked me a question that stuck with me. Have you ever tried just confronting them? Telling them how you really feel? I laughed it off at the time. Yeah, right, I said. Like that would change anything. But his words lingered. Part of me wondered, what would happen if I actually said what I was thinking? If I told Tom and Alex exactly how much they'd hurt me? How angry and unwelcome they made me feel? The idea was tempting, but it was also terrifying. What if it made things worse? And deep down, I knew my mom wouldn't take my side. She'd made that painfully clear over the years. If I spoke up, she'd just defend them, like she always did. So, I stayed quiet. I didn't say a word. Instead, I stopped trying to be part of the family altogether. Why bother? It wasn't my family. It wasn't even my home. I kept my head down, focused on surviving one day at a time, and waited for the day I could finally leave. Leave that house, leave that town, leave them behind. But even now, all these years later, the scars from those days are still there. I can still hear Tom's voice in the back of my mind, cold and dismissive. This isn't your place. Looking back now, I wish I'd stood up for myself. I wish I'd fought back instead of just taking it. But when you're a kid, surrounded by people who make you feel small and out of place, fighting feels impossible. Survival becomes the only goal, and sometimes, just making it through another day feels like enough. I thought things couldn't get worse, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Living in Tom's house already made me feel like I didn't belong, but when my half-brother Liam was born, It was like I disappeared entirely. Overnight, I became a ghost in my own home. Tom and Mom were completely wrapped up in their perfect little family. I was barely an afterthought. It's hard to explain what it feels like to watch everyone around you move on without you, to feel like you're the only one left behind. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of Liam crying, a constant reminder that he was the center of their world now. Tom would rush to soothe him, Mom right behind, smiling in that warm, glowing way I hadn't seen in years. It was clear as day that Liam was her everything. I don't think she ever looked at me like that again after Tom came into the picture. With Liam around, it felt like everything I did irritated Tom even more. If I left a glass in the sink, I'd get a lecture about respecting the space because the house had to be spotless for the baby. If I wanted to watch TV, I had to keep the volume practically on mute because Liam needs his rest. It didn't matter what I did, I was always an inconvenience. And Mom? She just made excuses. They're adjusting to having a newborn, she'd say, her tone dismissive. But I knew better. It wasn't about the baby. I was just in the way. One night, about a month after Liam was born, I sat alone at the kitchen table, eating dinner. Tom and Mom were in the living room with Liam, cooing over every little sound he made. I could hear their laughter drifting in from the other room. It sounded like a scene out of some perfect family movie. Only, I wasn't part of it. I was just an observer, watching from the sidelines. Midway through my meal, Alex sauntered into the kitchen and dropped into the chair across from me. He had that smug grin on his face, the one that always meant trouble. "You know, they're a lot happier without you around," he said, his tone casual, like he was commenting on the weather. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my food, but he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "Face it, Ben. You're just the leftover." It hit me like a punch to the stomach. I wanted to shrug it off, tell myself it was just Alex being Alex, but deep down, I couldn't. His words stayed with me because, in my heart, I knew they weren't just his thoughts. He was voicing what everyone else felt but wouldn't say out loud. As the days turned into weeks, it only got worse. Every little thing I did seemed to make me more of a problem. Everything I did seemed to set Tom off, and Alex never missed an opportunity to make me feel even smaller. Whenever Mom and Tom had friends or family over to meet Liam, I felt like the invisible guest, the kid no one bothered to include in the family photos. They'd pass Liam around like he was the crown jewel of the family, cooing and gushing over every little thing he did, while I sat awkwardly in the background, pretending it didn't bother me. But it did. One of the worst nights came during a big family dinner they threw to celebrate Liam's first few months. The house was packed with relatives I barely knew, all of them fawning over the new baby. I tried to stay quiet, shrinking into my seat at the table, when Tom's sister, Susan, leaned over and asked, "Oh, Kate, who's this?" Like I was some random stranger who'd wandered in. My mom barely glanced at me as she answered, "Oh, that's Ben," her tone dismissive, like she was talking about an old piece of furniture. "He's my son, from before." From before. Like I was some remnant of a past life she'd moved on from. Tom didn't even bother introducing me, and Susan gave me this awkward, pitying smile before going right back to gushing over Liam. I spent the rest of the dinner just trying to disappear. But Alex wouldn't let it go. Under the table, he kept kicking my leg, whispering insults whenever no one was looking. "Nobody even notices you," he hissed, or "You're such an embarrassment." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him to stop, but I knew better. If I caused a scene, I'd be the one labeled as the problem. So, I bottled it up, swallowing every word, every kick, until I thought I might burst. It all came to a head a few weeks later. That day at school had been brutal. I had a big project due, got called out by a teacher for zoning out, and to top it off, some guys on the basketball team decided to make me their target. By the time I got home, all I wanted was some peace and quiet. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen, there was Alex, leaning against the counter with that smug grin I'd come to hate. "Hey, Ben," he sneered. "Heard you had a rough day. Makes sense, you're not really cut out for much, are you?" I clenched my fists, trying to keep my cool. "Just leave me alone, Alex." But he wasn't done. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with malice. "You know, Liam's going to be 100 times better than you ever were. At least Dad actually wants him around." That was it. Something inside me snapped. Before I knew what I was doing, I shoved him, harder than I meant to. He stumbled back, hitting the counter with a loud thud. And that's when Tom came storming in, his face red with anger. "What the hell are you doing, Ben?" he shouted. "Are you seriously starting fights in this house now?" I tried to explain, to tell him what Alex had said, but he wouldn't hear a word of it. As far as Tom was concerned, I was always the problem. "Listen, I don't care what your excuse is," Tom snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut. "You don't get to treat people like that here. Maybe it's time you learned some respect." I barely had time to process his words before Mom walked in. She took one look at the scene, Tom angry, Alex nursing his fake hurt, and her expression said it all, disappointment mixed with frustration. She didn't even ask what had happened. She didn't look at me. Instead, she sided with Tom, just like always. "Ben," she said tiredly, her tone flat, "you need to apologize. This behavior isn't acceptable." I wanted to scream. To yell that it wasn't fair, that Alex was the one who'd been making my life miserable for years. But looking at their faces, Tom's seething anger, Mom's weary disapproval, I knew it wouldn't matter. To them, I was the problem. After that night, everything got worse. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, tiptoeing around the house, avoiding Tom, Alex, and even my mom. It was easier to disappear than to face their constant judgment. I spent as much time away from home as possible, crashing at Ethan's place or holing up in the library. Anywhere was better than staying in that house where I was nothing more than an inconvenience. Eventually, I gave up trying to be noticed. I'd come home, go straight to my room, and stay there until it was time to go back to school. Downstairs, I'd hear them laughing and talking, playing with Liam or planning family outings. Every word, every laugh felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I knew the truth. They didn't want me around. I was just a leftover from a life my mom had moved on from. One day, I came home from school to find my room had been rearranged. Tom had moved some of my stuff to make room for a crib. Apparently, my room was now the most convenient spot for Liam's naps. That was the final straw. My own room wasn't even mine anymore. It was just another part of their house. That night, I broke down. Sitting alone in the corner of my room, if I could even call it that anymore, I called Ethan. My voice cracked as I told him everything. The crib, the constant feeling of being pushed aside, how much I hated being there. Ethan listened, like he always did. He told me I deserved better, that I shouldn't have to live like this. But what could I do? I was trapped. Stuck between a family that didn't want me and a life that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I remember sitting in the dark after I hung up, staring at the walls of a room that no longer felt like mine. I wondered how much longer I could do this. How much longer I could survive feeling so invisible, so unwanted. Turning 18 became my only lifeline, the one thing keeping me going. While my classmates were planning graduation parties and figuring out which colleges they'd go to, I had a singular goal: get out. I'd spent enough years being a stranger in my own family, reminded every single day by Tom, Alex, and even Mom that I didn't belong. Moving out was the only way I'd ever feel free. The only way I'd finally take control of my own life. As soon as I was old enough, I got a job. I got a job at the local grocery store, bagging groceries and stocking shelves. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was barely enough to scrape by, but it was something. I saved every dollar I could, refusing to spend money on anything unless it was absolutely necessary. While my friends would head out after school to grab burgers or catch a movie, I always had an excuse. Saving up for something big, I'd say with a grin. They'd tease me, guessing I was saving for a car or maybe college, but I never told them the truth. The big thing I was saving for wasn't a car or tuition, it was freedom. Working kept me out of the house, which was reason enough to put in extra hours. Over time, I started volunteering for extra shifts. My manager, Jason, was a no-nonsense kind of guy. He barked orders and expected everything done his way, no questions asked. At first, we barely talked. He didn't seem like the type to make small talk, and I was fine with that. But one night, after the store closed, I stayed late to clean up a massive mess in aisle 6. Someone had knocked over an entire display of pasta sauce, and there were splatters of tomato sauce everywhere. I was halfway through mopping when Jason walked over, arms crossed, and watched me for a moment. "You're a hard worker, Ben," he said, surprising me. "Most kids your age would have left this for the morning crew." I shrugged. "Just trying to do a good job." From that night on, things changed. Jason started trusting me with more responsibilities. He let me work the register now and then, and eventually, he even handed me the keys, trusting me to lock up after closing. Each new responsibility came with a small bump in pay, and every extra dollar brought me closer to my goal. Meanwhile, things at home were as tense as ever. Tom had started making more digs about my future, always slipping in some passive-aggressive comment about how I needed a plan. He'd spend hours with Alex, helping him research colleges and talking about which sports scholarships he might qualify for. The two of them would sit at the dining room table, mapping out Alex's bright, shining future, while I barely got a glance. When Tom did talk to me, it was only to lecture me about my grades or demand to know why I hadn't applied to any colleges. "You're 18 now, Ben," he said one night, leaning against my doorway like he owned the place. "You need to figure out what you're going to do with your life. What's the plan? Are you planning to bag groceries forever?" His tone was laced with disdain, and it took everything in me not to snap. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm working on it," I said flatly. "Well, I hope so," he replied, his voice dripping with judgment. "Because I'm not going to support you forever." That was it, the final straw. I'd been saving for 2 years, and while it wasn't a fortune, it was enough. I had enough for a deposit and a couple of months' rent on a tiny, cheap apartment. That night, I made up my mind. I was moving out. The next morning, I pulled Mom aside to tell her my plan. The surprise on her face was obvious, and for a second, I thought she might try to talk me out of it. But she just sighed, like she'd already known this day was coming. I looked more exhausted than anything else. "Ben, are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked softly. "I'm sure, Mom," I replied. "I need to do this for myself. I can't keep living here like I don't belong." She glanced down, biting her lip, before nodding slowly. "If that's what you want, I guess I can't stop you." Telling Tom was a whole different story. I waited until everyone was home, hoping I could make it short and sweet. I told him I had saved up enough and was ready to live on my own. Tom's face went bright red. "You think you're just going to walk out of here and everything will be easy," he snapped. "Life doesn't work like that, Ben. You're going to crash and burn." I clenched my fists, holding back the urge to shout. "Maybe, but it's my decision." Alex, sitting on the couch, wore that smug grin of his. "Good luck, man. You'll definitely need it." Even as I packed my things, Tom didn't stop his rant. He kept saying I was making a mistake, that I was being selfish. Mom tried to calm him down, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes too. It stung, but I reminded myself this wasn't about them, it was for me. Finally, with just a few boxes stuffed into the back of Ethan's car, I was ready to go. As we pulled out of the driveway, the last thing I saw was Mom standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me leave. I wanted to believe she was sad, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling she might have been relieved. My first night in the new apartment felt like a dream. It was tiny, barely enough room for a twin bed, a dresser, and a kitchen that looked like it had been stuck in the 80s. But it was mine. No Tom, no Alex, no feeling like I was an intruder. For the first time in years, I felt free. Ethan helped me move in, and we celebrated with some cheap pizza, sitting on the floor, talking about our futures. He was planning to go to a nearby community college, so we'd still see each other a lot. I told him my plans too: keep working, save up, maybe even go back to school when I had enough. Over the next few months, I settled into a routine. I worked long hours, picked up extra shifts when I could, and little by little, made the place feel like home. I found a second-hand couch, hung up some old posters, and even got a couple of houseplants. Every night, I came home exhausted but satisfied, knowing everything I had was because I worked for it. Then one day, I got a text from Mom. She asked if I'd come over for dinner. I hadn't seen her since I moved out, and part of me was curious. Despite everything, I missed her. So when I showed up, she greeted me with a hug, but it was a little awkward, like she wasn't sure if I would pull away. The dinner that followed was uncomfortable. Tom kept making passive-aggressive comments about my independent lifestyle, and Alex barely looked in my direction. Mom tried to keep the conversation light, asking about my job, but it was obvious Tom didn't want me there. After dinner, as I was getting ready to leave, Mom pulled me aside. "Ben, you know you're always welcome to come back if things get tough. I shook my head. Thanks, Mom, but I'm okay. I'm better off this way. As I walked out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was finally closing a chapter. The years of feeling trapped, of always being on the outside, were behind me. I had my own place, my own life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. I guess, deep down, I always knew I wasn't really a part of that family. But finding out about Tom's will was the final straw. By then, I had been living on my own for over a year. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was getting by. I had saved a little, started taking classes at the community college, and felt like I was building something I could be proud of, away from all the judgment and cold stares that used to define my everyday. Then one day, I got a call from Mom. She asked if I could come by for lunch that weekend. She didn't say much, but there was something in her voice, nervousness, maybe, as if she was holding something back. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I hadn't been back to the house much since I moved out, just the occasional holiday or Mom's birthday. But even then, it was always uncomfortable. Tom would sit there with his arms crossed, barely acknowledging me, while Alex would make snide comments, like nothing had changed. Even though I'd built my own life, being around them always brought back those awful memories. When I arrived that Saturday, Mom greeted me at the door with a tight hug. It felt strange, like she was trying to hold onto something that was already slipping away. Inside, everything looked just as it always had, too perfect, too pristine, like a house staged for sale rather than one where real people lived. Tom was sitting in the living room, barely glancing up as I walked in. Alex was sprawled out on the couch with that smug look on his face. Liam, now a rambunctious toddler, was running around with a toy truck, blissfully unaware of the tension hanging in the air. After a few minutes of small talk, Tom finally cleared his throat and looked at me for the first time since I arrived. "Ben," Tom began, his voice cold and emotionless, just like it always had been. "There's something we need to discuss. As a family." The word family stung, considering I'd never really felt like I was a part of theirs. I braced myself, nodding for him to continue. "I've recently updated my will," Tom went on, pausing to exchange a glance with Mom. She looked away, her eyes downcast, and my stomach dropped. "I want to be transparent with everyone about my decisions, so there are no surprises down the road." I could feel Alex's eyes on me, practically sparkling with satisfaction. A part of me wanted to get up and walk out right then, but I stayed, holding my breath as Tom continued. "In the event of my passing," he said, his tone casual, almost too businesslike, "my assets will be divided equally between Alex and Liam." He glanced at me with a blank expression. No explanation. No apology. Just a statement of fact. "I've made sure that they'll be taken care of. Their future is secure." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket, each syllable driving home the painful reality I'd already known deep down. I wasn't a part of this family. I was just there. A loose end. An afterthought. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just sat there, numb, as everyone waited for a reaction. I looked at Mom, hoping for something, anything, that would show she disagreed with this, or at least acknowledged how hurtful it was. But she just sat there, her eyes fixed on the floor, saying nothing. Finally, I found my voice. "So you're cutting me out completely?" I asked, doing my best to keep the bitterness out of my tone. Tom shrugged, completely unfazed. "It's not about cutting you out, Ben. It's about securing a legacy for my sons, Alex and Liam. They're my blood. You have your own life now, your own future. I trust you'll find your own way." The words hit me like a slap in the face. Your own way. Is that all I was to him? A loose thread in his perfect life? I had always known he didn't see me as his son, but hearing it spelled out so bluntly was like a punch to the gut. I looked at Mom again, desperate for some kind of reassurance, some sign that she still cared. But she just avoided my gaze, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "You know," I said slowly, my voice trembling, "I always knew I wasn't part of this family. But I never thought you'd make it so obvious." Alex snorted, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Oh, come on, Ben. Don't act surprised. This was always how it was going to be. Dad's just doing what's fair." I clenched my fists, doing my best to hold back the anger building inside me. "Fair?" I snapped. "You think this is fair?" Tom sighed, looking irritated. Let's not turn this into a spectacle. I'm trying to be honest with you. I'm trying to treat you like an adult here. You're old enough to understand these things, Ben, Tom said, his voice as cold and emotionless as ever. Family. Legacy. Inheritance. It's not about feelings. It's about responsibility. I could barely wrap my mind around it. I'd spent years under his roof, fighting to belong, sacrificing everything just to keep the peace, and now he was telling me it meant nothing? That in his eyes, I was never really part of this family? Without another word, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through me. You know what, Tom? Keep your legacy. I don't need anything from you. As I turned to walk away, Mom's voice stopped me. Ben, please don't go like this, she pleaded, her words strained, filled with guilt and sadness. But I was done. For the first time, I didn't need to explain myself or try to make her understand. I was done trying to fit into a family that had never truly wanted me. I wasn't going to beg for their acceptance anymore. That night, as I returned to my apartment, I felt more alone than I ever had. The anger tore through me, but beneath it all, there was a suffocating sense of relief. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to keep hoping for a family that would never be. It was over. For weeks, I buried myself in work, focusing on myself and the people who actually cared about me. Ethan was there, as always, reminding me that family wasn't defined by blood, and slowly, I started to spend more time with those who made me feel whole. The people who saw me for who I was, not where I came from. Learning about Tom's will had been brutal, but it was the catalyst I needed to finally cut the ties. I didn't need to prove myself to anyone anymore. I didn't need their validation. I had my own future now, and that was enough. I realized something then. Family wasn't about blood or legacy. It was about love, respect, and support. If they couldn't offer me that, then they weren't family. Not really. Then, in the middle of an exhausting shift at the grocery store, my world shifted once again. The cashier called me over, saying there was a man on the phone asking for me, something about a family matter. I wiped my hands on my apron, a sense of unease creeping in, but I wasn't expecting anything that would shake me. When I picked up the phone, a smooth, professional voice greeted me on the other end. Mr. Bennett, the voice asked, cold and authoritative. I'm Lawrence Moore, an attorney from a law firm you may not be familiar with. I'm contacting you regarding the estate of your relative, Rose Bennett. I froze. Rose Bennett. The name rang a bell, but just barely, like a fragment of a story I'd heard years ago and never bothered to listen to. I couldn't place her, and the thought that she'd be contacting me, let alone remember I existed, was almost laughable. Okay, I stammered, my mind racing. I'm sorry, but I don't think I knew her. Lawrence's voice didn't waver. He was prepared for this. Ms. Rose Bennett was your father's second cousin. She lived most of her life in California, very reclusive. She passed away a few months ago. After a thorough search, we've determined you are her closest living relative. My heart skipped a beat. I was drowning in confusion, trying to pull together the fragmented details of my father's side of the family. He left when I was a kid, and I hadn't heard a thing about his family since. The idea that one of them would even acknowledge me, let alone leave me something, let alone this, felt like a sick joke. But I stayed quiet, almost afraid to speak, letting him finish. As her nearest relative, you are the primary beneficiary of her estate, Lawrence continued, his voice flat, like he was discussing a business transaction. The assets total approximately $15 million. My mind went blank. The words felt like a slap across the face, then a punch to the gut. $15 million? I thought I'd misheard him. Wait, you're serious? I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Quite serious, Mr. Bennett, he responded. We've processed all the necessary documentation, and the funds are ready for transfer, pending your approval. However, I'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss the details in person. My fingers were trembling as I set the phone down, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a lead blanket. $15 million. $15 million. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. How could this be happening? I had been scraping by for so long, surviving on every last shift, cutting corners just to keep the lights on, and now, out of nowhere, a fortune from a woman I had barely heard of? When I arrived at Lawrence's office a few days later, I still felt like I was trapped in a dream. The firm was housed in a sleek glass building downtown, the kind of place I never thought I'd even step foot in, let alone walk into. Every step felt like I didn't belong, like I was going to be thrown out any second. But Lawrence greeted me with a firm handshake, leading me into a conference room where he laid out the paperwork. Rose Bennett was an enigma, eccentric, reclusive. She had inherited her own fortune from her family, but lived her life in solitude, avoiding the world around her. She never married, had no children, and spent her last years in peaceful isolation, surrounded only by a few close friends who respected her need for seclusion. Ms. Bennett left you this inheritance because she admired your independence, Lawrence said, his gaze steady but filled with something like respect. She valued resilience. She wanted you to have this because, in her eyes, you embodied those qualities. I sat there, numb, as the full weight of what was happening settled over me. $15 million. From a woman I barely knew. From a family I barely knew. Everything I had fought for, every moment of struggle, every sleepless night, none of it had prepared me for this. A legacy I never expected. A fortune I didn't deserve. A reality I couldn't even begin to process. And yet, there it was, right in front of me. She wanted us to find a relative who shared those qualities, Lawrence continued, his voice steady, almost clinical. After extensive research, we found you. I was frozen. The idea that anyone, let alone a relative I'd never met, would think of me like this, would see me as someone worthy of something so significant, felt like a punch to the gut. But as the enormity of the situation started to settle in, one thing became brutally clear. I wasn't telling my family about this. After everything with Tom, Alex, and even Mom, I knew exactly how they'd react. If they found out, they'd come crawling out of the woodwork, pretending like they cared, like they'd been there for me all along. Tom would guilt-trip me, probably trying to make me feel obligated to share, and Alex? He'd make cutting remarks until I caved. And as for Mom, I couldn't even bear the thought of her. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd expect me to use this windfall to prove myself to Tom. But that wasn't going to happen. This was mine. No one else's. No one could take it from me. The first thing I did was quit my job. I was done. Jason, my manager, looked like I'd slapped him when I told him I wasn't coming back. I'd always been the dependable one, the worker who never let them down. He wished me well, but I saw the confusion in his eyes. I smiled, knowing he had no idea how right he was about to be. Next, I started making plans, real plans for the first time in my life. Money was no longer a worry. I could live wherever I wanted. I could travel. I could go back to school. The freedom was intoxicating, overwhelming. The world was wide open, but I wasn't rushing. I needed time. I needed to take a step back and think, really think, about what I wanted for myself, for my future. So, I started investing in me. I moved into a sleek apartment with a view of the city skyline. No more cramped, dingy spaces. I bought new furniture, the kind that was mine, not some old, second-hand crap. I even treated myself to a new wardrobe, throwing out the hand-me-downs, the thrift store finds, replacing them with clothes that actually fit, that made me feel like I finally belonged somewhere. One night, as I stood on my balcony, looking out over the city, the weight of everything hit me all at once. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. No one was looking down on me. No one was telling me I didn't belong. No one was judging me. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I had managed to keep the inheritance a secret for a while, but eventually, it all came crashing down. Word got out. I don't know how, maybe a coworker saw me around, noticed the changes, the new life I was building, but one day, the phone rang. It was Mom. "Ben," she said, her voice shaky, hesitant. I heard you came into some money recently." My stomach plummeted. I hadn't told anyone, not a soul. And yet she knew. How the hell did she know? My pulse raced as the walls seemed to close in around me. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I held my breath, forcing the words out slowly, trying to keep my composure. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. "Yeah, a little," I replied cautiously, trying to keep the truth buried. I wasn't about to let her know the full extent of things. "Oh, Ben, that's wonderful," she exclaimed, her voice suddenly bright and eager, more enthusiasm than I'd heard from her in years. Tom and I were just talking about how we could use some help with a few things around the house. You know how it is. I felt my jaw tighten, my patience snapping. Mom, I don't think I'm in a position to. Oh, I know, sweetie, she cut me off, her tone suddenly sickly sweet, like honey mixed with guilt. We'd never ask if it wasn't important, but you know how hard things have been with everything going on. Liam needs some extra tutoring, and Alex with his college expenses. It was like she had a script she was reading from, rattling off every expense they had as if it was somehow my responsibility. Every word was another weight on my chest, another pressure to bend to their will. The way she spoke, I could hear the unspoken expectation that I should step in and fix it all, like I was some kind of safety net. Mom, I interrupted, cutting her off with force. I'm sorry, but I can't help you with that. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the phone. Her disbelief was palpable, and I felt a sharp, almost vindictive satisfaction from it. Ben, I don't understand. This family has always been there for you. I nearly choked on the irony. Really? Because from where I'm standing, it always felt like I was the outsider. She stammered, scrambling to find the words, but I didn't give her the chance. I was done. I'd found my freedom, and I wasn't going to let them pull me back into their twisted world of manipulation and guilt. When I hung up, I felt something inside me shift, a weight I didn't even know I was carrying lifted off my shoulders. For years, I'd felt like I owed them, like I had to prove myself. But that call made me realize I didn't owe them anything. I could finally live on my own terms, without the suffocating pressure of their expectations. In the months that followed, I did exactly that. I traveled, seeing places I'd only dreamed of. For the first time, the world felt open to me. I even started my own business, a small but rapidly growing tech startup. It was everything I had ever wanted. I surrounded myself with people who actually cared about me, people who didn't see me as some means to an end, who didn't expect anything from me except respect and friendship. As for my family, I kept my distance. I'd spent too much of my life trying to fit into their world, trying to be what they wanted me to be. But now, I had my own life, my own world. And I wasn't looking back. Then, like clockwork, they found out about the inheritance. The second they knew, the entire dynamic shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't the outsider anymore. No, now I was the golden ticket, the easy solution to their problems. The moment I became the key to their comfort, they acted like I was the most important person in their lives. It was laughable. It started small, subtle hints from Mom during our infrequent calls. It's so wonderful that you've gotten yourself settled, she'd say, her voice sickly sweet and laden with unspoken demands. Been so blessed, she said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. You know, the house has been needing some serious repairs, the roof especially. It's been leaking for years. The words hung in the air, heavy with expectation. It was a script she had clearly rehearsed, and it was impossible to ignore the message behind it. You're going to pay for this, right? I clenched my jaw. I wasn't about to let them pull me back into their web of manipulation. Then Tom, who hadn't given a damn about me in years, reached out. He was trying so hard to sound sincere, but the falseness was suffocating. Liam's education is incredibly important to us, as you know, he said. The costs are rising, and we'd hate for him to miss out on opportunities because of finances. It was a thinly veiled plea, disguised as concern, but I wasn't buying it. They never cared about Liam's future. I knew what he was really doing, trying to get his hands on my money. If the roles had been reversed, I would have been invisible to them. But now, suddenly, I was their savior. Then came the flood of distant relatives, cousins, second cousins, aunts, uncles. People I hadn't heard from in years, some of them over a decade. All of them trying to worm their way in with cheerful, fake pleasantries. Hey Ben, it's been so long. We should catch up. Followed by the way, I heard the amazing news. One cousin, a distant memory from a family reunion when I was 7, reached out with a sob story about how she had always thought we were close. And within moments, she switched gears, asking if I could help her with a loan for her business, something she knew I'd be interested in. The entitlement was suffocating, and I felt my blood boil. At first, I tried to handle it all with grace, deflecting their advances, keeping my responses brief. But it didn't stop. They wouldn't leave me alone. Mom's calls grew more frequent, always with a new crisis. There's a leak in the basement, Ben. The roof is leaking again, and Liam's grades are slipping. Tom's struggling to keep up with the bills. It was exhausting. And then Tom sent me an email with a detailed breakdown of Liam's schooling costs, as if he were trying to make me an investor. I nearly choked on the audacity of it. And then came the email with the subject line, "Your duty as part of this family." I almost shattered my phone in fury when I read that. When it became clear I wasn't going to bend to their demands, they escalated. I got a letter one evening, an official-looking envelope that felt like a gut punch. It was from a law firm, representing my mother and Tom. They were suing me. They were seeking a portion of my inheritance, claiming that family members should support one another in times of need. They argued I had a moral obligation to provide for them. My heart raced with anger and disbelief. I couldn't believe what I was reading. How far were they willing to go? The same people who had shoved me aside, treated me like I didn't matter, were now trying to steal from me. The one thing I had, my inheritance, the one thing that was truly mine, wasn't even safe. It was like they couldn't stand the thought of me succeeding on my own terms. They couldn't bear the idea of me living a life free from their control, free from their demands. They were trying to tear me down, piece by piece. And I wasn't going to let them. Not anymore. Fortunately, I had Lawrence, the attorney who'd handled Rose's estate. When I showed him the lawsuit, he barely even blinked. He took his time, going over the letter, and when he looked up at me, there was a small, confident smile on his face. "Ben, this is just an attempt to intimidate you," he said calmly. "They have no legal ground. Let me handle it." And handle it he did. Over the next few weeks, Lawrence systematically tore apart their case, piece by piece. He gathered every document, every shred of evidence showing how they had never supported me. How I had been on my own for years, struggling just to keep my head above water while they had offered me nothing. He even pulled up financial records that proved I had been self-sufficient since I moved out, while they had put nothing toward my well-being. When I saw the mountain of evidence Lawrence had gathered, it was like a fortress of protection around me. For the first time, I felt truly invincible, like no one could touch me. Their case was dismissed almost instantly. But of course, that didn't stop Mom. The phone rang, and her voice came through, drenched in fake tears. She was crying, trying to manipulate me, accusing me of tearing the family apart. "How dare I? I was selfish," she said. "I was turning my back on the people who raised me." The words sliced through me, but I didn't flinch. "Not this time." "I didn't tear the family apart, Mom," I said, my voice colder than I thought possible. "That happened long before I got this inheritance." The silence that followed felt like victory. I had stood my ground, and for the first time in my life, I hadn't been swayed by guilt. After that, the calls stopped. Tom sent a few bitter texts, but they were nothing more than empty threats. I ignored them. The weight that lifted from my shoulders was like nothing I'd ever felt before. I had finally broken free. I had faced down my past, faced them, and refused to be manipulated. It was like I had closed a chapter of my life that had haunted me for years. With the family drama behind me, I turned my focus to the people who actually mattered. The people who had always been there for me, no strings attached. Ethan had stood by me through everything, and over the years, I had made a few other friends who'd become more family than my own flesh and blood. There was Jade, who was fierce in her loyalty and who had been with me through thick and thin, and Marcus, a coworker who had shown me what real support looked like. These were the people who truly had my back, who never asked for anything in return, and they were who I wanted to invest my time in. Still carrying the weight of the past, I realized I needed to get help processing all the bitterness and resentment. I started seeing Dr. Carla Hayes, a therapist who radiated warmth and empathy. The moment I sat down in her office, I felt a sense of relief. I poured out everything, years of being pushed aside, of being used as a financial crutch, of never feeling like I mattered. Dr. Hayes listened without judgment, her eyes soft and understanding. When I finished, she spoke with a calm confidence that made me feel seen for the first time in years. "Ben, it sounds like you've been carrying a tremendous weight for so long. But the fact that you're here, willing to confront all of this, shows incredible strength." And it did. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was starting to live. Dr. Hayes helped me unpack the rage, the shame, and the guilt. She taught me how to build boundaries and stand firm in who I was, not who they wanted me to be. For the first time, I understood that wanting respect, wanting peace, wasn't selfish. It was my right. She encouraged me to focus on what brought me joy, to surround myself with people who saw me for me, not for what I could do for them. And as I did that, I felt like I was shedding the last remnants of the past. I wasn't a pawn in their game anymore. I wasn't some broken piece of their puzzle. I was free. Finally, free. And for the first time, I truly felt alive.